diseased are egotists, whether the disease be of the mind or the body, whether it be sin, sorrow, or merely the more tolerable calamity of some endless pain or mischief among the chords of mortal life. Such individuals are made acutely conscious of self by the torture in which it dwells. Self, therefore, grows to be so prominent an object with them that they cannot but present it to the face of every casual passer-by. Hawthorne. As one views modern man in his innumerable exhibitions of irresponsibility and defiance, one may discern, if he has the courage to see what he sees, which, as Charles Pegler reminded us, is the higher courage, a prodigious egotism. This egotism, which is another form of fragmentation, is a consequence of that fatal decision to make a separate self the measure of value. A figure from Neoplatonism is suggested, and one may picture the original spirit manifesting itself in many particulars, which lose sight of their original source and decide to set up godheads in their own right. Since under conditions of modern freedom, the individual thinks only of his rights, he does not refer his action to the external frame of obligation. His wish is enough. He cannot be disciplined on the theoretical level, and on the practical level he is disciplined only by some hypostatized social whole whose methods become brutal as its authority turns out to be, on investigation, merely human. The sin of egotism always takes the form of withdrawal. When personal advantage becomes paramount, the individual passes out of the community. We do not mean the state, with its apparatus of coercion, but the spiritual community, where men are related on the plane of sentiment and sympathy, and where, conscious of their oneness, they maintain a unity not always commensurable with their external unification. Such withdrawal, which has been given the disarming name of enlightened selfishness, and which more often than not is inspired by the desire to be, quote, equal, end quote, is pulverizing modern society, and there is no precept in modern ideology with which to rebuke it. For, is not this equal man a kind of king, superior to the trappings of royalty, and cannot such a one do what he will with his life? The various declarations of independence have given him freedom from all the bondages. Yet the blight which has fallen today on all sorts of human relationship must be ascribed to the psychological and even physical withdrawal from sympathy. Inevitably, there follows an increase of selfishness. It is the simple nature of egotism to view things out of proportion, the, quote, I, end quote, becoming dominant, and the entire world suffering a distortion. Once more we are face to face with the fact of alienation from reality. No man who knows himself in his ab extra relationships can be egocentric, but he who is cognizant mainly of self suffers an actual derangement, as Plato saw. Quote, the excessive love of self is in reality the source to each man of all offenses, for the lover is blinded about the beloved, so that he judges wrongly of the just, the good, and the honorable, and thinks that he ought always prefer his own interest to the truth. End quote. Accordingly, self-absorption is a process of cutting oneself off from the, quote, real, end quote, reality, and therefore from social harmony. I think it is worth noting, too, that Nathaniel Hawthorne, an earnest student of erring souls, concluded, after a lifetime of introspection and reflection, that egotism is the unpardonable sin. He exposed through allegory what, quote, social mindedness, end quote, endeavors to combat in contemporary society. Its causes must now be described. The split in the theory of knowledge which took place at the time of the Renaissance is enough to account for that form of ignorance which is egotism. Under the world view possessed by medieval scholars, the path of learning was a path to self-deprecation, and the philosophier doctor was one who had at length seen a rational ground for humilitas. Study and meditation led him to a proper perspective on self, which then, instead of caricaturing the world with the urgency of its existence and the vehemence of its desires, found a place in the hierarchy of reality. Dante's "In la sua volontade e nostra pace" is the final discovery. Thus knowledge for the medieval idealist prepared the way for self-effacement. An opposing conception comes in with Bacon's, quote, knowledge is power, end quote. If the aim of knowledge is domination, it is hardly to be supposed that the possessors of knowledge will be indifferent to their importance. On the contrary, they begin to swell. They seek triumphs in the material world, knowledge being, meanwhile, necessarily degraded to skills, which inflate their egotism and self-consideration. Such is a brief history of how knowledge passes from a means of spiritual redemption to a basis for intellectual pride. In the Greek fable, as in Christian, it is asserted that there is a forbidden knowledge which brings nothing into the world but woe. Our generation has had ample demonstration of what that knowledge is. It is knowledge of the useful rather than of the true and the good, of techniques rather than of ends. If we insist that our problems are philosophical, we cannot expect a return to selflessness without an epistemological revision which will elevate the study of essences above that of particulars, and so put in their proper modest place those skills needed to manipulate the world. Nothing can be done until we have decided whether we are primarily interested in truth. In the absence of truth, there is no necessity, and this observation may serve as an index to the position of the modern egotist. Having become incapable of knowing, he becomes incapable of working, in the sense that all work is a bringing from the ideal, from potentiality, into actuality. We perceive this simply when his egotism prevents realization that he is an obligated creature, bound to rational employment. The modern worker does not, save in rare instances, respond to the ideal in the task. Before the age of adulteration, it was held that behind each work there stood some conception of its perfect execution. It was this that gave zest to labor and served to measure the degrees of success. To the extent that the concept obtained, there was a teleology in work, since the laborer toiled not merely to win sustenance, but to see this ideal embodied in his creation. Pride in craftsmanship is well explained by saying that to labor is to pray, for conscientious effort to realize an ideal is a kind of fidelity. The craftsmen of old did not hurry, because the perfect takes no account of time, and shoddy work is a reproach to character. But character itself is an expression of self-control, which does not come of taking the easiest way. Where character forbids self-indulgence, transcendence still hovers around. When utilitarianism becomes enthroned and the worker is taught that work is use and not worship, interest in quality begins to decline. How many times have we heard exclamations of wonder that the care which went into some article of ancient craftsmanship before modern organization drove a wedge between the worker and his product? There is a difference between expressing oneself in form and producing quantity for a market with the eye to speculation. Hegre wished to know what had become of the honor of work. It has succumbed to the same forces as have all other expressions of honor. It is a normal thing for any class to adopt the ideas of a class above it, and here is another argument for the importance of rational hierarchy, even when those ideas happen to be about itself. That series of subversive events which raised the middle class to a position of dominance allowed it not only to prescribe the conditions of labor, but also to frame the world of discourse of economics. Here begins modern labor's history. In conflict with an exploiting and irresponsible bourgeoisie, it found no alternative but to avail itself of the bourgeois philosophy and strike back. Accordingly, workers' organizations accepted in their practice the idea that labor is a commodity when they began the capitalist technique of restricting production in the interest of price. Labor, which is bought and sold by anonymous traders, cannot feel a consecration to task. Its interest becomes that of commercialism generally. How much can be had for how little? Today, workers seek to diminish their commodity in order to receive a larger return within the price framework. Controlled and artificial scarcity becomes a means of class promotion or even of class survival. Thorstein Veblen saw financiers restricting the production which engineers were eager to realize. Now we see, in addition, labor organizations restricting output in the interest of group advantage. The object is not to say that labor is more or less to blame than other groups of society. It is rather to show that when egotism becomes dominant and men are applauded for looking to their own interests first, statesmanship and philosophy must leave the picture. The evidence shows that the middle classes spread the infection. However that may be, the consequence is a fragmentation of society which cannot stop short of complete chaos. When the egotist thinks of himself first and the task second, he is, like the ontologist mentioned at the beginning, denying the reality of forms imperfectly realized. The reality, then, is merely the actuality which his desire or whim cares to produce. He thinks not of subordinating self to end, but of subordinating end to self. Such reversals of role makes rational distribution impossible, for only when labor is seen in the context of its performance can a rational estimate of reward be made. We know how to reward the carpenter qua carpenter. We do not know how to reward the egotist who comes with assertions of how much he is worth. That payment to labor which merely reflects the outcome of a tug-of-war is removed from philosophical determination. In this way, disintegration has placed labor in a position in which it must compete against other groups in a manner which cannot bring ultimate advantage to any of those involved. What we get at length is the institutionalization of unilateral sentiment. Every group is given freedom and even inducement to help itself at the expense of other groups, and it has been found that the most effective means is a simple extortion, a withdrawal from the communal effort until self-inspired demands are met. This is, of course, the egocentric solution. The bourgeoisie first betrayed society through capitalism and finance, and now labor betrays it by embracing a scheme of things which sees profit only, not duty and honor in work. This view will seem hopelessly unrealistic to those who do not admit that sentiment toward the whole is the only ultimate means of measuring value. Yet it will eventually appear that the greatest disservice done to our age, and it has been done by sentimental humanitarianism, was this denial of necessary connection between effort and reward. The reign of sophists, economists, and calculators has ushered in the era of egotistic competition, which makes sabotage an approved instrumentality. The laborer feels justified in putting a stop to the whole productive process if his own appraisal of his service is not accepted, and this appraisal is not made with reference to what society exists for. This, we repeat, is a matter for enlightened sentiment, but with reference to his own gratification. It would be an unpopular man who should suggest to the present generation that work is a divine ordinance. The idea has been grouped with the widely misinterpreted divine right of kings, and if we examine the matter closely, we find that the two are indeed related. For whether one is a worker or ruler, the question becomes at once, what is the real source of his authority to act? That Governor John Winthrop found a solution for this problem is worth knowing. In a statement to the General Court of Massachusetts in 1645, he said, quote, "The questions that have troubled the country have been about the authority of the magistracy and the liberty of the people. It is you who have called us into this office, but being called, we have our authority from God. It is the ordinance of God, and it hath the image of God stamped upon it, and the contempt of it has been vindicated by God with terrible examples of his vengeance." End quote. In other words, the leader may be chosen by the people, but he is guided by the right, and in the same way, we may say that the worker may be employed by anyone, but that he is directed by the autonomous ideal in the task. Now, when men cease to believe that labor is divine ordinance, their attitude toward it becomes like their attitude toward the secularized state. The state is then wholly man's contrivance, but egotistic men are competitors. They are seeking to get the better of one another and to evade demands made on them by their theoretical equals. Much of the effort of modern politicians is devoted to convincing us that men serve best when they are serving one another. But the one consideration which would make this true is left out. Service to others is the best service when the effort of all is subsumed under a transcendental conception. Material gratification does not provide this, and here one has the reason why a secularized state finally breeds an intense hatred of politicians who are trying to get men to accept one another as taskmasters. Work is not to be performed, quote, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye, end quote, but for my neighbor, whom I despise. The situation deteriorates because the idea that work is something apportioned out by men leaves people discontented with their portion and dubious about whether work is a good thing at all. How technology reinforces the latter feeling will be discussed later. It is sufficient to note here that the ancient moral injunction to labor fades when we regard our work as cut out for us by men, who, by present dogma, are no better than ourselves. That curious modern hypostatization, quote, service, end quote, is often called in to substitute for the now incomprehensible doctrine of vocation. It tries to secure subordination by hypothesizing something larger than self, which turns out, however, to be only a multitude of selfish selves. The familiar change from quality to quantity may again be noted. One serves not the higher part of the self. This entails hierarchy too, pointing finally to commission from above, but merely consumer demand. And who admires those at the top of a hierarchy of consumption? Man, as consuming animal, is thus seen to be not enough. Like other theories of individualism and materialism, the right of man to be an egotist finds support in various plausibilities. Is not man the first thing to be considered? It will be asked. Is he not to be given preference over abstract rights, privileges, and so forth? What this question fails to see is that man's egotism renders impossible the kinds of organizations which would allow him to prosper to a degree. When he puts himself first in this sense, the victory is Pyrrhic. The only way to give him anything that will last is to place him in a structure where opportunity and ability may meet. This cannot be done by considering egotistic demands first. Such short-sightedness destroys the supporting structure. Thus, sentimental humanitarianism, ignorant of fundamental realities but ever attentive to desires, wrecks society. The egotism of work increasingly poses the problem of what source will procure sufficient discipline to hold men to production. When each becomes his own taskmaster and regards work as a curse which he endures only to gain means of subsistence, will he not constantly seek to avoid it? An employer was recently heard to remark that we have plenty of persons today who can tell us why a machine will not work, but none will tell us why men will not work. The new socialist governments of Europe, finding production falling off, have already begun to use the incentive of piecework. Elsewhere, open use has been made of war and the fear of war to hold workers to their jobs. And President Truman's proposal, on a certain occasion, to confront recalcitrant labor with military induction is the clearest proof that a nation which egotism has paralyzed will, in an emergency, have recourse to its most rigorous forms of discipline, the services trained for armed combat. It thus appears that the spirit of self which has made the worker lose sight of the calling of his task, and to think only of aggrandizement, is the plainest invitation yet offered by the Western world to the tyranny of force. Such, then, are the consequences when egotism begins to influence that daily service which is labor. But there is a yet more sensitive register of this influence in the specialized activity known as art. And here is the testimony is as concurrent as it is overwhelming. It is illuminating to trace the ravages of egotism in aesthetic expression. There is a significant saying that nature imitates art, and it is often pointed out that in the great epics of expression, nature and art seem faithful to one another, so that what art creates does not fade. But what are we to say of epics like our own, in which art appears unnatural, grotesque, and irresponsible, so that we feel it to be the product of some dangerous subjectivism? Is not this the parting of the ways which occurs when man leaves the truth of reality and expresses himself in isolation? Nature does not follow where art becomes not truer than history, not ideally true, but false to the higher reality. It is egotism which enforces the separation between nature, by which is meant here the enduring reality, and art. A historical survey of this aspect of the descent may well begin with a glance at literature. The great changes affecting the literature of our time began with those subterranean forces which erupted in the French Revolution. Though much of the 18th century was a period of competing tendencies, it was the Romantic Revolt which finally carried the day. This revolt would seem to have made its first appearance in the doctrine of ethical optimism, propounded by the Earl of Shaftesbury, in opposition to the orthodox view of human nature, which acknowledged original sin and preached the necessity of education and restraint. It taught that man has a natural, moral sense, which can be relied on, not only to recognize virtue, but to delight in it. The important consequence for literature was the sanctioning of impulse, which now became the subject of endless and varied exploitation. The first proof that this was to be a serious influence on literature emerged with the poetry and fiction of sensibility. Poets such as Joseph Warton, William Collins, Edward Young, and later Oliver Goldsmith, professing a contempt for the formal life of cities and the conventions of prevailing literary fashion, uncovered their senses, so to speak, to the beauty and strangeness of nature, and talked of the simple occurrences of life, and followed the novelist of sensibility, Thomas Amory, Lawrence Sterne, and others who put their heroes through a sort of sentimental vagabondage, and held them up to admiration as men of feeling. Sterne's remark that the pen governed him and not he, it is a revealing commentary upon the mood of revolt against intellect. Implied in the premises which Shaftesbury set forth was sentimental comedy. Previously, comedy had been satirical, and satire, it is important to note, always bespeaks an age which recognizes good and evil and makes distinctions among human beings accordingly. In a world where all men are naturally good, the erring one is merely misled. Confront him with the consequences of his ways, and he reforms, as did the hero in the sentimental comedy. These ideas together imply that man is good, that experience is good, and that therefore the career of any individual may be worth following in the fullness of its unique detail. We're at the beginning of the Confessions. Quote, "I am different from all men I have seen. If I am not better, at least I am different." End quote. He expressed directly the note of egotistic sensibility. The Romantic Deluge followed at the beginning of the 19th century. There appeared at this point a group of great expressionists, men of resourcefulness and enormous activity, whose influence on literature has been second, perhaps, only to that of the Elizabethans. They sounded with greater insistence the idea of the pre-romantics, which we have just reviewed. Foremost was the impulse of revolt against conventions and institutions. Whether it was Wordsworth cultivating the speech of ordinary men and endeavoring to read, quote, the common face of nature, end quote, or Byron declaiming upon the ruins of Rome, or Shelley denouncing, quote, bloody faith, the foulest birth of time, end quote. A theme of emancipation from the sentiments and forms which it brought in European culture persists. The motif was likely to be accompanied by extensive explorations of the individual consciousness, with self-laceration and self-pity. The sensitive individual turned inward, and there discovered an appalling well of melancholy and happiness which was attributed to the perverse circumstances of the world. Thus, we behold in spectacular form the new familiar act of withdrawal. As the individual fosters self-awareness, the young romantic Gautier in Werther, and Shelley crying, quote, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed, end quote, continue the indulgence in egocentric sensibility. During the whole of the century, this flood rushed on, but it later assumed expressions which are to be grasped, it seems, only upon the level of complex significance. Some of the Romantics, despite the delight in disorder dictated by Romanticism, turned into the most meticulous craftsmen in literary history. This anomalous development was owing to a realization by the more perceptive that raw experience, exaggerated sensibility, and large moral and political enthusiasms alone mean artistic bankruptcy. Some therefore sought in form a means of salvation, but it was with a romantic's interest in form. The French have a phrase which seems to describe this exactly. It was maladie du scrupule, which drove Flaubert and the de Goncourt, and later Henry James, and numerous poets to suppose that unremitting attention to form would save the subject matter of romantic art. Hence, we have prodigies of faithful observation, le mot juste, and a fineness of texture in poetry. But somehow another fragmentation has taken place. Form has become obsessive. Confinement to form is one means of evading those heavier responsibilities which must be related to one's total awareness, or his view of man's destiny. Concurrent with this attempt to escape bankruptcy through brilliance of form was another which sought to escape it through imagination. In one respect, the Romanticists who became symbolists were not faithful to the premises of the movement. In another, they were conspicuously faithful. Symbolism is a reaction against the deification of the material world, because the symbol is always a sign of things that are not compresent in the time and space. The symbol, by its nature, transcends and thus points to the world beyond the world. So the symbolists were reaching for the outer reality, which to the simple early Romantics was but a vague presence. They found that experience did not interpret itself, and they were driven to difficult feats of intellection and representation in their effort to convey the significant reality. But the symbolists retained a Romantic's interest in the intimate and in the individual, with the result that their symbols came not from some ideology universally accepted, but from experiences almost private. Possibly the libertarian mood survives here. The artist still wishes to have free range and to soar, and a normal medium of communication would hold him too close to the social context. We must certainly acknowledge that it was the vulgarization of language through journalism and kindred activities which impelled many literary artists, including some workers in prose, to seek out fresh media. One may honor them for their heroism, even though the result was not, from all points of view, fortunate. At any rate, writers increasingly employed the fleeting metaphor and the faintly evocative symbol. And while it is unjust to talk, as some have, of, quote, the cult of unintelligibility, end quote, and of, quote, poets talking to themselves, end quote, it seems fair to say that the symbolists put themselves under very special handicaps and limitations, which grievously widened the gap between poetry and the public. Let us now turn to the story of music, a medium which, as Schopenhauer observed, is uniquely related to the will. Here we discover a decline which extends from the fugues of Bach to the cacophonous arrangements of modern jazz. The degenerative influences upon music parallel closely those upon literature, with the difference of a slight time lag. The 18th century remained a strongly classical period, wherein music expressed the aristocratic and international qualities of the social order. Mozart, in its most perfect exponent, accepted, quote, without a suspicion of discomfort, end quote, the traditional forms, furnishing an example of freedom and restraint, of balance and resiliency. Here is one of the happiest illustrations occurring just prior to the Romantic Deluge of what is possible with freedom and law. The portents of change came with Beethoven, whose sympathy with the French Revolution must not be overlooked. A great architect in music, Beethoven, nevertheless, through the introduction of dynamism and of strains of individualism, pointed the way which the succeeding century was to take. The 30s and 40s mark the specifically romantic period in music. This interval exhibited a pronounced change in form and subject matter, in which all the affinities of romanticism are to be seen. Composers sought effects, designed contrasts and imitations, strove for climaxes, as, like their literary contemporaries, they turned to the expression of bizarre or perverse feeling. All the while, music was taking on a decidedly public character, which manifested itself in the growth of opera and concert. As one student has put it, the 19th century brought in the journalist of music, who has served this art in the same way in which he served literature. Music was now fully secular and ready to follow the divergent tendencies of the time. Especially significant was the steady decay of symphonic form, which effectively mirrored the progressive dissolution of the class system. A modern critic has remarked that, quote, the whole framework of society, whose relation to the individual symbolizes the cadences and codas that gently restrain the flow of Mozart's passionate line, is crumbling away, if not already completely desiccated, end quote. From Music Ho by Constant Lambert. We are even told that the symphonic form was repellent to Mussorgsky because its first movement predominance signified to him aristocratic domination. Music had its impressionist movement, with Liszt and Debussy. Especially, it turned to the exploitation of color and atmosphere, and even to the conjuring up of visual images. The phrase was technically a flight from the construction and balance of classical form. In effect, it was a concentration upon the, quote, emotive fragments, end quote, with which the painters had been occupying themselves. Footnote. In Ravel, music offers a parallel to Cézanne, whom I shall discuss at the end of the chapter. For Ravel, after a period of absorption, so to speak, in subject matter turned back toward, quote, clarity of thought and sobriety of form, end quote. We now return to the main text. Thus, three broad stages may be recognized in the decline of music in the West. In its highest form, this music was architectural. It then became thematic, and finally, before the incidence of certain present-day reactions, textural. It hardly needs pointing out that this is a movement away from the autonomous and integrated ideal toward a collection of fragments which afford maximum opportunity for a subjective and egotistic expression. I have deferred until last the discussion of jazz, which seems the clearest of all signs of our age's deep-seated predilection for barbarism. The mere fact of its rabid conquest of the world indicates some vast extent of inward ravage, so that there were no real barriers against the disintegration it represents. Jazz was born in the dives of New Orleans, where the word appears first to have signified an elementary animal function. It was initially a music of primitivism, and we have the word of one of its defenders that, quote, jazz has no need of intelligence, it needs only feeling, end quote. This is by Robert Goffin from Jazz. But jazz did not remain primitive. Something in the Negro's spontaneous manifestation of feeling linked up with Western man's declining faith in the value of culture. The same writer admits that, quote, if one examines the fields of activity which have been reserved for art, one perceives that the creative work of our ancestors was under the impulse of a harmonious equilibrium between reason and sentiment, end quote. This is from Ibid, also from Robert Goffin. Jazz, by formally repudiating restraint by intellect and by expressing contempt and hostility towards our traditional society and mores, has destroyed this equilibrium. That destruction is a triumph of grotesque, even hysterical emotion over the propriety and reasonableness. Jazz often sounds as if in a rage to divest itself of anything that suggests structure or confinement. It is understandable, therefore, that jazz should have a great appeal to civilization's fifth column, to the barbarians within the gates. These people found it a useful instrument for the further obliteration of distinctions and the discrediting of all that bears the mark of restraint. Accordingly, it is taken up in a professional way, and was sophisticated by artists of technical virtuosity, so that it became undeniably a medium of resourcefulness and power. That is all the more reason for recognizing its essential tendency. The driving impulse behind jazz is best grasped through its syncopation. What this can achieve technically, we need not go into here. What it indicates spiritually is restlessness, a desire to get on, to realize without going through the aesthetic ritual. Forward to the climax, it seems to say, let us dispense with the labor of earning effects. Do we not read in this another form of contempt for labor, Is it not again the modern fatuity of insisting upon the reward without the effort? Form and ritual are outmoded piety, and work is a sacrifice. The primitive and the bored sophisticate are alike impatient for titillation. As dissent breeds further dissidence, so the emancipation which is jazz gives rise to yet greater vagaries. In, quote, swing, end quote, one hears a species of music in which the performer is at fullest liberty to express himself as an egotist. Playing now becomes personal. The musician seizes a theme and improves as he goes. He develops, perhaps, a personal idiom for which he is admired. Instead of that strictness of form which has made the musician like the celebrant of a ceremony, we now have individualization. We hear a variable into which the musician pours his feeling and whimsy more freely than the romantic poets laid bare their bleeding hearts. Jazz has been compared to, quote, an indecent story, syncopated and counterpointed, end quote. There can be no question that, like journalism in literature, it has helped to destroy the concept of obscenity. In view of such considerations, it comes as no surprise to hear a statement that jazz is the music of equality and that it has made an important contribution to the fight for freedom. As far as the negative idea of freedom goes, the idea of, quote, freedom from, end quote, the case is too clear to need arguing. By dissolving forms, it has left man free to move without reference, expressing dithyrambically whatever surges up from below. It is a music not of dreams, certainly not of our metaphysical dream, but of drunkenness. The higher centers have been proscribed so that the lowers may be uninhibited from executing their reeling dance. Here, indeed, is a music to go with empiricism, and it is only natural that the chief devotees of jazz should be the primitive, the young, and those persons, fairly numerous it would seem, who take pleasure in the thought of bringing down our civilization. The fact that the subjects of jazz, in so far as it may be said to have subjects, are grossly sexual or farcical, subjects of love without aesthetic distance, and subjects of comedy without law of proportion, shows how the soul of man craves orgiastic disorder. And it is admitted that what man expresses in music dear to him, he will most certainly express in his social practices. Painting, too, offers its story of what happened to the human psyche in the course of this descent. If one looks thoughtfully at a gallery of pictures of the modern school, he is likely to notice a peculiar weakness. The theme is not adequate to the craftsmanship. He is observing in another sphere of endeavor the predominance of means over ends. To say that the greatest art must be sustained by story does not mean that it must be, quote, about, end quote, something. It would be more accurate to say that topicality occurs after story has been lost. The endless expression of mythology in art, which was the achievement of Greece, objectifies the metaphysical dream of Greek civilization. Its artistic purpose was not to acquaint with story, but to utilize story in the creation of significant form. So was it with Christian art. If the proper sentiments are present, there is no need to confuse our appreciation of the topic with our aesthetic appreciation. The mentality which divides over topics and fights battles is symptomatic of disintegration. When a culture is unified on the imaginative level, the unity affects an abridgment of egotism among the members. The trend towards modernism got underway with the rise of portrait painting in the 15th century. This was followed by a significant development of interest in landscape, which in itself expresses a shift from use of story to interest in technique. The early Renaissance painters had no interest in landscape as such. It was for them mere background, to be formalized and scanted, because man had not then lost his attribute of divinity. He was for them the center of the world, a thing like, quote, seen, end quote, for which the ordinary man of today is likely to stand for the whole of art. They did not even recognize a thing like, quote, seen, end quote, which for the ordinary man of today is likely to stand for the whole of art. They did not even recognize. As painters turned toward landscape and still life, the prevailing interests in the physical world became reflected in art. This trend reached a culmination in the 19th century with Impressionism. The movement of Impressionism, which is the revolutionary event of modern painting, has been attributed to a variety of causes. Clive Bell is inclined to see it simply as a rediscovery of paganism. This meant the acceptance of life as good and satisfying in itself, with a consequent resolution to revel in the here and now. The world of pure sensation thus became the world of art. R.H. Wilenski sees Impressionism as a result of the introduction of the camera, and hence, one might say, of the Industrial Revolution. In his view, the attempt of the artists to imitate the achievements of mechanical device degraded perception to a mere, quote, seeing, end quote. They tried to register vibrations of light, as does the camera, and nothing more. Though limitations forced upon them one or another kind of architectural synthesis, it has been suggested that Impressionism served the ends of equalitarian socialism, since if a picture is only the result of exposure to light waves, one tree or one field or seascape will be the same for all. My interpretation is that Impressionism brings nominalism into painting. One of the cardinal tenets of the doctrine is that outline does not exist in nature. Consequently, the main object was, quote, the ultimate divorce of the picture from any convention, whether of arrangement, of drawing, or of a fixed palette, end quote. From Modern Painting by Willard Huntington Wright. At this point, then, we find the artists, too, applying the doctrine of universalia post rem, with which our story first began. If form does not exist prior to things, naturally it is realism to paint things. In the work that stemmed from this position, one sees two important signs of disintegration. The first is the repudiation of form. In their practice, the Impressionist painters sought to avoid it by making substance or color perform the whole role. A second, and a related sign, was the acceptation of ephemerality. It will be found always that those who immerse themselves in substance must also immerse themselves in time. The artists of this school consecrated upon, quote, catching upon canvas the fugitive accents of nature, end quote. So, Monet, studying changes of light, painted the haystack at 9, at 10:30, and again at 12. Such procedure explains well enough the remark of Baudelaire that art was losing respect for itself, as it prostrated before exteriors. The symbolizing of perception through representation was being dropped in favor of an immediate contact with the flux of reality. It could be asked whether the thesis of this passage is not refuted by the presence of Cézanne in the period under discussion. Now, it is true that Cézanne was a great artist, and that he consorted with and learned from the Impressionists, but it is not true that finally he was one of them. On the contrary, Cézanne was the first to raise questions of whether sensational truth is the end of art, and the answer to this in the painting of his late period, an answer that dealt with the world through abstraction and simplification, was such that his work had been termed, quote, a pure metaphysical monument, end quote. Cézanne is thus an important instance of a phenomenon already observed in literature, wherein the sensitive artist, after brilliant performance within the limits of a vogue, perceives those limits and seeks to transcend them. Such was his course when he professed a hope of making Impressionism as rigorously classical as the Parthenon. It should cause no astonishment that artists are the first to see that subjectivism and egotism form a cul-de-sac. They are, in the highest sense, the seers. Other victims of these maladies stumble along on instinct or seek to rationalize their great errors. The broader character of the movements we have been following represents a psychic urge to collapse all order, a technical effort to get something without tolerating a medium, which is but another exhibition of the passion for immediacy. Whether we regard the excess of literary romanticism, or the syncopation of jazz, or impressionism in painting, the story is the same. We witness attempts, often ingenious and powerful, to get form without consenting to form. And then we see the beginnings of reaction in symbolism and abstract art. Egotism in work and art is the flowering, after long growth, of heresy about human destiny. Its abhorrence of discipline and form is usually grouped with the signs of, quote, progress, end quote. It is progress for those who neither have a sense of direction nor wants responsibility. The heresy is that man's destiny in the world is not to perfect himself, but to lean back in sensual enjoyment. Indeed, there is something expressive of both the philosophy and the technique of artistic impressionism in the lines from Whitman's Song of Myself, block quote. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass, end quote. The choice was first made in the late Middle Ages, when its fateful nature could be appreciated because cognition still proceeded with reference to ultimates. Progressively, it has become a matter of indifference. When masses of men reach a point at which egotism reigns so blandly, can their political damnation be far distant? They have rejected their only guarantee against external control, which is self-discipline, taught and practiced. If they no longer respect community and direct their efforts according to a common understanding, they fall out. Programs like the Four Freedoms, with their vague political unrealism, instead of helping the situation, serve only to codify error. It is the presumption of egotism which renders people unfit for the philosophic anarchy they appear to think of. An ancient axiom of politics teaches that spoiled people invite despotic control. Their failure to maintain internal discipline is followed by some rationalized organization in the service of a single powerful will. In this particular, at least in history, with all her volumes vast, has but one page. Chapter 5. The Great Stereopticon. Quote, sick are they always, They vomit their bile and call it a newspaper." End quote. Nietzsche. The disappearance of the primordial synthesis has profound consequences which are felt even by those below the level of philosophy, and it is they, ironically, who make the first effort to repair the damage. It scarcely needs adding that their lack of penetration renders the effort abortive, for what they do when fragmentation has reached the point of danger is to attempt a restoration by physical means. The problem with disintegration places in the lap of practical men those in charge of states, of institutions, of businesses, is how to persuade to communal activity people who no longer have the same ideas about the most fundamental things. In an age of shared belief, this problem does not exist, for there is a wide area of basic agreement, and dissent is viewed not as a claim to egotistic distinction, but as a sort of excommunication. The entire group is conscious of the tendency, which furnishes standards for value judgments. When the goal of life becomes self-realization, however, this vanishes. It vanishes right at the point where the ego asserts its independence. Thereafter, what reconciliation can there be between authority and individual will? The politicians and businessmen are not interested in saving souls, but they are interested in preserving a minimum of organization, for upon that depends their posts and their incomes. These leaders adopted the liberal solution. That was to let religion go, but to replace it with education, which supposedly would exercise the same efficacy. The separation of education from religion, one of the proudest achievements of modernism, is but an extension of the separation of knowledge from metaphysics. And the education, thus separated, can provide their kind of indoctrination. We include here, of course, the education of the classroom, for all such institutionalized instruction proceeds on the assumptions of the state. But the education which best accomplishes their purpose is the systematic indoctrination from day to day of the whole citizenry through channels of information and entertainment. The vested interests of our age, which, from all kinds of motives, desire to maintain traditional values or to get new values set up in their place, have constructed a wonderful machine, which we shall call the Great Stereopticon. It is the function of this machine to protect selected pictures of life in the hope that what is seen will be imitated. All of us in the West, who are within the long reach of technology, are sitting in the audience. We are told the time to laugh and the time to cry, and signs are not wanting that the audience grows ever more responsive to its cues. A great point is sometimes made of the fact that modern man no longer sees above his head a revolving dome with fixed stars and glimpses of the primum mobile. True enough, but he sees something similar when he looks at his daily newspaper. He sees the events of the day refracted through a medium which colors them as effectively as the cosmology of the medieval scientists determined his view of the starry heavens. The newspaper is a man-made cosmos of the world, of events around us at that time. For the average reader is a construct with a set of significances which he no more thinks of examining than did his pious forebear of the 13th century, whom he pities for sitting in medieval darkness. Think of questioning the cosmology. The modern man, too, lives under a dome, whose theoretical aspect has been made to harmonize with a materialistic conception of the world, and he employs its conjunctions and oppositions to explain the occurrences of his time with all the confidence of the now supplanted disciple of astrology. The Great Stereopticon, like most gadgets, has been progressively improved and added to until today. It is a machine of three parts: the press, the motion picture, and the radio. Together, they present a vision of life quite as controlled as that taught by medieval religionists, though feeble in moral inspiration, as we shall see. It is now our object to look at the effects of each in turn. No one is prepared to understand the influence of journalism on the public mind until he appreciates the fact that the newspaper is a spawn of the machine, a mechanism itself. It has ever been closely linked with a kind of exploitation, financial and political, which accompanies industrialism. The press is the great scribe, possessed of that preponderance of means which technology always provides. The ease with which it multiplies stereotypes makes it the ideal servant of progress. It thrives on an endlessness of dissemination. Its progeny, like the frogs of Egypt, come up into our very kneading troughs. But just because the mechanical victory of the press is so complete, we are likely to ignore the conditions on which its work proceeds. I serve notice, therefore, that we here approach a question of blasphemous nature, a question whose mere asking disturbs the deepest complacency of the age, and that is, has the art of writing proved an unmixed blessing? The thought challenges so many assumptions that to consider it requires almost a fresh orientation in philosophy. But we must recall that it occurred to Plato, who answered the question in the negative. With him, it considered the issue of whether philosophy should be written down, and his conclusion was that philosophy exists best in discourse between persons, the truth leaping up between them, quote, like a flame, end quote. In explanation of this important point, he makes Socrates relate a myth about the Egyptian god Theuth, a mighty inventor who carried his inventions before King Thamos, desiring that they be made available to the people. Some of the inventions the king praised, but he stood firmly against that of writing, declaring that it could only be a means of propagating false knowledge and an encouragement to forgetfulness. Socrates adds, the view that anyone who leaves writing behind on the supposition that it will be, quote, intelligible or certain, end quote, or who believes that writing is better than knowledge present to the mind, is badly mistaken. Now, Plato was disturbed by written discourse because it has, quote, no reticences or proprieties toward different classes of persons, end quote, and because if any individual goes to it with a question in his mind, it, quote, always gives one unvarying answer, end quote. And we find him making in the 7th epistle the extraordinary statement that, quote, no intelligent man will ever be so bold as to put into language those things which his reason has contemplated, especially not into a form that is unalterable, which must be the case with what is expressed in written symbols, end quote. Obviously, here is a paradox, and the present writer is aware of risking another in a book which calls attention to the sin of writing. The answer to the problem seems to be that the written discourse is under a limitation, and that whether we wish to accept that limitation to secure other advantages must be decided after due reference to purposes and circumstances. In the good society, it is quite possible that man will not be so dependent on the written word. In any case, for Plato, truth was a living thing, never wholly captured by men, even in animated discourse, and in its purest form, certainly never brought to paper. In our day, it would seem that a contrary presumption has grown up. The more firmly an utterance is stereotyped, the more likely it is to win credit. It is assumed that engines as expensive and as powerful as the modern printing press will naturally be placed in the hands of men of knowledge. Faith in the printed word has raised journalists to the rank of oracles. Yet could there be a better description of them than these lines from the Phaedrus? Quote, "They will appear to be omniscient, and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome, having the reputation of knowledge without the reality." End quote. If the realization of truth is the product of a meeting of minds, we may be skeptical of the physical ability of the mechanism to propagate it, as long as that propagation is limited to the printing and distribution of stories, which give, quote, "one unvarying answer," end quote. And this circumstance brings up at once the question of the intention of the rulers of the press. There is much to indicate that modern publication wishes to minimize discussion. Despite many artful pretensions to the contrary, it does not want an exchange of views, save perhaps on academic matters. Instead, it encourages men to read in the hope that they will absorb. For one thing, there is the technique of display, with its implied evaluations. This does more of the average man's thinking for him than he suspects. For another, there is the stereotyping of whole phrases. These are carefully chosen not to stimulate reflection, but to evoke stock responses of approbation or disapprobation. Headlines and advertising teem with them, and we seem to approach a point at which failure to make the stock response is regarded as faintly treasonable, like refusal to salute the flag. Especially do the journalists of mass circulation exploit the automatic response. So journalism becomes a monstrous discourse of protagoras, which charms by hypnotizing and thwarts that participation without which one is not a thinking man. If our newspaper reader were trained to look for assumptions, if he were conscious of the rhetoric in lively reporting, we might not fear this product of the printer's art. But that would be to grant that he is educated. As the modern world is organized, the ordinary reader seems to lose means of private judgment, and the decay of conversation has about destroyed the law. And the decay of conversation has about destroyed the practice of dialectic. Consequently, the habit of credulity grows. There is yet another circumstance which raises grave doubts about the contribution of journalism to the public weal. Newspapers are under strong pressure to distort in the interest of holding attention. I think we might well afford to overlook the pressure of advertisers upon news and editorial policy. This source of distortion has been fully described and is perhaps sufficiently discounted, but there is at work a far more insidious urge to exaggerate and to color beyond necessity. It is an inescapable fact that newspapers thrive on friction and conflict. One has only to survey the headlines of some popular journal, often printed symbolically in red, to note the kind of thing which is considered news. Behind the big story there nearly always lies a battle of some sort. Conflict, after all, is the essence of drama, and it is a truism that newspapers deliberately start and prolong quarrels, by allegation, by artful quotation, by the accentuation of unimportant differences. They create antagonism where none was felt to exist before, and this is profitable practically, for the opportunity to dramatize a fight is an opportunity for news. Journalism on the whole is glad to see a quarrel start and sorry to see it end. In the more sensational publications, this spirit of passion and violence manifested a certain recklessness of diction, with vivid verbs and fortissimo adjectives, creeps into the very language. By the attention it gives their misdeeds, it makes criminals heroic and politicians larger than life. I have felt that the way in which newspapers raked over every aspect of Adolf Hitler's life and personality since the end of the war shows that they really have missed him. They now have no one to play the Antichrist against the bourgeois righteousness they represent. In reviewing the persistent tendency of the newspaper to corrupt, I shall cite a passage from James Fenimore Cooper. Though Cooper lived before the advent of yellow journalism, he seems to have stated the essential situation with a truth and eloquence impossible to improve on, when he said, in the American Democrat, quote, "As the press of this country now exists, it would seem to be expressly devised by the great agent of mischief to depress and destroy all that is good, and to elevate and advance all that is evil in the nation. The little truth that is urged is usually urged coarsely, weakened and rendered vicious by personalities, while those who live by falsehoods, fallacies, enmities, partialities, and the schemes of the designing find the press the very instrument that the devils would invent to effect their designs." End quote. 100 years later, Huey Long made a statement of impolitic truth when he called his tax on newspapers a, quote, "lie tax." End quote. How in the light of these facts can one hesitate to conclude that we would live in greater peace and enjoy sounder moral health if the institution of the newspaper were abolished entirely? Jefferson observed at one time that it would be better to have newspapers and lack a government than to have a government and be without newspapers. Yet we find him in his 70th year writing to John Adams, quote, "I have given up newspapers in exchange for Tacitus and Thucydides, for Newton and Euclid. I find myself much the happier." End quote. The Russians, with their customary logical realism, which ought to come as solemn admonition to the Western mind, have concluded that freedom to initiate conflicts is not one of the legitimate freedoms. They have therefore established state control of journalism. If newspapers can do nothing but lie, they will at least lie with the interest of the state, which, according to the philosophy of statism, is not lying at all. Certainly, it remains to be seen whether the Western democracies, with their strong divisive forces, can continue to allow a real freedom of the press. In limited areas, indeed, there are now signs that the day of that freedom is over. We see this silently arising in the appearance of the press agent and the public relations officer. More institutions of every kind are coming to feel that they cannot permit an unrestricted access to the news about themselves. What they do is simply set up an office of publicity, in which writers skilled in propaganda prepare the kinds of stories those institutions wish to see circulated. Inevitably, this organization serves at the same time as an office of censorship, de-emphasizing or withholding entirely news which would be damaging to prestige. It is easy, of course, to disguise such an office as a facility created to keep the public better informed, but this does not alter the fact that where interpretation counts, control of source is decisive. During the Second World War, the United States government set up a vast office of war information, the object of which was to interpret the struggle from all points of view of an administration which had been all along pro-war. In this day of skilled competition for public favor, even separate departments of government have their public information services. I shall illustrate by citing in some detail from a recent press dispatch from Washington. Quote, "The United States Navy, which in pre-war days hid its light under a bushel, has decided to embark on a high-powered publicity program. End quote. Its plan, the account goes on to say, is to gather a staff of 500 men, the duties of which will be to provide, quote, photographs, radio programs, and other public information about the Navy, end quote. The development resulted, it is explained, from a realization that during the war, quote, the publicity machines of the Army and the Army Air Forces were able to capture public support to the detriment of the Navy's reputation, end quote. In the course of the war, this candid correspondent declares the Navy made some effort to get in step with the times when it, quote, introduced modern advertising agency methods and discarded the traditional name of the Office of Public Relations for the more euphemistic Office of Public Information, end quote. Such is the policy of seeing that there is enough news and that it originates in the proper hands. The practice is becoming universal. Not only departments of governments and private businesses, but even universities have concluded that freedom of access to news turns out to be expensive and embarrassing. So much for forces which kept this part of the Stereopticon from giving us the living truth. Now, let us turn to the second part. Every student of the motion picture has been impressed with the great resourcefulness of this medium. The movie producer is a maker almost to the extent of the poet, for he is working with a means capable of transforming subject matter. His production carries the evaluative power implicit in all dramatic representation, and it is, in the usual course of affairs, employed for purposes of entertainment. These 2 points bear consideration. We need not speak of the enormous influence of this synoptic depiction of life upon children and adolescents. This is a point concerning reticences and proprieties toward the different classes of persons. Our interest is rather in the deleterious effects of moviegoing upon even the adult mentalities that find satisfaction in it. That the public as a whole misses the issue of the motion picture's influence can be from its attitude toward censorship. For what the public is reconciled to seeing censored are just the little breaches of decorum which fret bourgeoisie, respectability, and sense of security. The truth is that these are so far removed from the heart of the problem that they can well be ignored. The thing that needs to be censored is not the length of the kisses, but the egotistic, selfish, and self-flaunting hero, not the relative proportion of undraped breast, but the flippant, vacuous-minded, and also egotistic heroine. Let us not worry about the jokes of dubious propriety. Let us rather object to the whole story, with its complacent assertion of the virtues of materialistic society. We are speaking here, of course, from the fundamental point of view. A censorship of the movies to be worthy of the name would mean a complete reinterpretation of most of their themes, for the beliefs which underlie virtually every movie story are precisely the ones which are hurrying us on to perdition. The entire globe is becoming imbued with the notion that there is something normative about the insane sort of life lived in New York and Hollywood, even after that life has been exaggerated to suit the morbid appetite of the thrill seeker. The spurious nature of the, quote, interest, end quote, of the ordinary movie shows an indifference to the real issues of life. The producer, in order to make his offerings attractions, that is, in order to make them beguiling, must present them as slick and false as advertising. It has been said that tragedy is for aristocrats, comedy is for bourgeoisie, and farce is for peasants. What percentage of the output of motion picture factories can qualify as tragedy? Footnote 1. A different but more serious question is what percentage of genuine tragedies could be identified as tragedies by a modern audience. For the inability of the contemporary mind to recognize tragedy when it is presented, see Robert B. Heilman's, quote, Melpomene as a wallflower, end quote. Sewane Review, Winter 1947. We now return to the main text. With the animated cartoon, a growing percentage qualifies as farce. But romance and comedy, these measure the depth of the world which movie audience wishes to see. The third part of the Great Stereopticon is the radio and television. Because they bring the human voice, unique opportunities are open to them. The primary effect of the radio is to disorder further our picture of the world by diminishing the opportunity for genuine selection. In its systems of programs, it has achieved a, quote, rationalization, end quote, which results in the wildly irrational. One skims through a newspaper practicing a certain art of rejection. The movie he may stay away from, but the radio is insistently present. Indeed, the victims of this publicity are virtually hunted down. In few public places do we escape it, and our neighbor's loudspeaker may penetrate the very sanctum of our privacy. In our listening, voluntary or not, we are made to grow accustomed to the weirdest of juxtapositions, the serious and the trivial, the comic and the tragic, follow one another in mechanical sequence without real transition. During the recent war, what person of feeling was not struck by the insanity of hearing advertisements for laxatives between announcements of the destruction of famous cities by aerial bombardment? Is it not a travesty of all sense to hear reports fraught with disaster, followed by the comedy variety with its cheap wit and arranged applause? This applause, of course, tells the listeners when to react and how, and so further submerges them in massness. Footnote 2. It is a fact in keeping with others which we have cited that rural and urban tastes in radio differ. An official survey was made by the Bureau of Agricultural Economics found whereas with city people, quote, comedy variety shows are the overwhelming favorites, rural people generally seemed to prefer the more serious type of programs, such as news and market reports, religious music, and sermons, end quote. We now return to the main text. Here, it would seem, is the apotheosis. Here is the final collapsing of values, a fantasia of effects, suggesting in its wild disorder the debris left by a storm. Here is the daily mechanical wrecking of hierarchy. Not to be overlooked in any gauging of influence is the voice of the announcer and commentator. The metaphysical dream of progress dictates the tone, which is one of cheery confidence, assuring us in the face of all contrary evidence that the best is yet to be. Recalling the war years once more, who has not heard the news of some terrible tragedy which might stagger the imagination and cause the conscientious artist to hesitate at the thought of its depiction? Given to the world in the same tone, commends a brand of soap, or predicts fair weather for the morrow. There were commentators, it is true, who got the spirit of gravity into their speech, but behind them stood always the announcer, denying by his formula of regular inflection the poignancy of their message. The radio, more than press or screen, is the cheerful liar. Thus the broadcast of chaos comes in a curious monotone. This is the voice of the hollow men who can see the toppling walls of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome without enough soul to sense tragedy. It is the tone of those dead to sentiment, but this is as we predicted. The closer man stands to ruin, the duller grows his realization. The annihilation of spiritual being precedes the destruction of temple walls. The radio is, last of all, a prime instrument for discouraging the thought of participation. It is the natural monopoly of communication, for turning whole populations into mute recipients of authoritative edicts. What better means could there be? A national radio hookup is like the loudspeaker system of a battleship or a factory, from which the post of command can transmit orders to every part. If we grant the assumptions of the materialists that society must conform to the developments of science, we may as well prepare ourselves for a monolithic state. Thus far we have been speaking of specific temptations to suppress and distort. It is now time to look at the fundamental source of the harm done by the Great Stereopticon. If we are pleading for unity of mind, and if we admit the necessity for some degree of subjective determination, it might appear that this machine, with its power to make the entire environment rhetorical, is a heaven-sent answer to our needs. We do not, in the final reckoning, desire uninterpreted data. It is precisely the interpretation which holds our interest. But the great fault is that data, as it passes through the machine, takes its significance from a sickly metaphysical dream. The ultimate source of evaluation ceases to be the dream of beauty and truth, becomes that of psychopathia, a fragmentation, of disharmony and non-being. The operators of the Stereopticon, by their very selection of matter, make horrifying assumptions about reality. For its audience, that overarching dome becomes a sort of miasmic cloud, a breeder of strife and degradation and of the subhuman. What person taking the affirmative view of life can deny that the world served up daily by press, movie, and radio is a world of evil and negation? There is iron in our nature, sufficient to withstand any fact that is present in context of affirmation, but we cannot remain unaffected by the continued assertion of cynicism and brutality. Yet these are what the materialists in control of publicity give us. The sickly metaphysical dream is not the creation solely of those who have cast restraint to the winds to seek profit in sensationalism. It is the work, too, of many who profess higher ideals, but who cannot see where their assumptions lead. Fundamental to the dream, of course, is the dogma of progress, with its postulate of the endlessness of becoming. The habit of judging all things by their departure from the things of yesterday is reflected in most journalistic interpretation. Hence the restlessness in the criteria of magnitude and popularity. The fact that capitalism seems to flourish only by expansion is no doubt connected with this. But whatever the cause may be, there is no law of perfection where there are no standards of measure. The touchstone of progress simply schools the millions in shallow evaluation. Somehow, moreover, the metaphysics of publicity have absorbed the idea that the goal of life is happiness through comfort. It is a state of complacency supposed to ensue when the physical appetites have been well satisfied. Advertising fosters the concept, social democracy approves it, and the acceptance is so wide that it is virtually impossible today, except from the religious rostrum, to teach that life means discipline and sacrifice. It means, in the world picture of press agency, a job, domesticity, interest in some harmless diversion such as baseball and fishing, and a strong antipathy towards abstract ideas. This is the Philistine version of man in pursuit of happiness. Even Carlyle's doctrine of blessedness through work has overtones of strenuousness which are repugnant to the man of today, because the journalist philosophers evaluate the multifarious objects and events of the world by their appeal to the greatest possible number of this type, it is not to be expected that they will recommend the arduous road of spiritualization. As for the latter, it cannot be said too emphatically that the operators of the Great Stereopticon have an interest in keeping people from breaking through to deeper significances. Not only is the philosopher a notoriously poor consumer, he is also an unsettling influence on society's careless of justice. That there are abysses of meaning beneath his daily routine, the common man occasionally suspects. To have him realize them in some apocalyptic revelation might well threaten the foundation of materialist civilization. It is no wonder that the experienced employers advertise for workers who are married and sober, for the other type sometimes begins to wonder which is the real reality, and they cannot afford help which might behave as Santayana, when he reportedly deserted the Harvard lecture room at the voice of spring, or Sherwood Anderson when he left without adieu the Ohio paint factory. The speculations of journalism seldom go beyond the confines of business and propriety, and its oracles have been quick to assail those who come with disturbing notions, quick and unscrupulous too, if they sense that the notions contain some necessary truth. In this they bear out the observation of Socrates that society does not mind an individual being wise. Only when he begins to make others wise does it become apprehensive. This is to say that they fear the spread of what has truth and reason on its side. Has any brilliant social critic of the last century received something better than a sneer from the pundits of journalism until his appreciation by the thoughtful forced a grudging recognition? Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Pegre, Spengler. It is impossible for journalism to take these people seriously. The existence of the one threatens the existence of the other. The proprietors of the Stereopticon have a pretty clear idea of the level at which thinking is safe for the established order. They are protecting a materialist civilization growing more insecure and panicky as awareness filters through that it is over an abyss. Thus, by insisting upon the dogma of progress, by picturing physical sufficiency as the goal of living, by insulating the mind against thoughts of an imminent reality, the Great Stereopticon keeps the ordinary citizen from perceiving, quote, the vanity of his bookkeeping and the emptiness of his domestic felicities, end quote. It is the great projection machine of the bourgeois mentality, which we have already seen to be psychopathic in its alienation from reality. It is curious to see how this mentality impresses those brought up under differing conditions. I recall with especial vividness a passage from Walter Hines' Pages, the autobiography of Nicholas Worth. Page, who grew up in the Reconstruction South and later went north to school, had received his earliest impressions in a society where catastrophe and privation had laid bare some of the primal realities, including the existence of evil. A society, too, in which the, quote, primitive infection, end quote, of the African race, to use a term employed by Jung, had developed in the white man some psychological cunning. It seemed to Page that his northern acquaintances had, quote, minds of logical simplicity, end quote. Footnote 3. In his novel The Bostonians, which deserves to be better known, Henry James sends the, quote, southern, end quote, type of mind into a northern environment, with consequences that corroborate Page's thesis. We now return to the main text. Such, I think, must be the feeling of anyone who comes out of a natural environment into one in which education, however lengthy and laborious, is based on bourgeois assumptions about the real character of the world. It is a mind which learns to play with counters and arrives at answers which work in a bourgeois environment. If we reverse this process and send the, quote, mind of logical simplicity, end quote, into regions where mystery and contingency are recognized, we reenact the plot of Conrad's Lord Jim. There is a world of terrifying reality to which the tidy moralities of an Anglican parsonage do not seem applicable. Footnote 4. An anthropologist related to me that certain Negro tribes of West Africa have a symbol for the white man, consisting of a figure seated on the deck of a steamer in a position of stiffest rigidity. The straight, uncompromising lines are the betrayal. The primitive artist has caught the white man's unnatural rigor, which contrasts ominously for him with the native's sinuous adaptation. A mind nurtured on press, motion picture, and radio cannot be otherwise in relation to the complexity of the world. Its instructors do not teach it to use the, quote, proper reticences and proprieties, end quote, towards things. And so, its ideas may be comical simplifications. We now return to the main text. Seen from another point of view, the Great Stereopticon is a translation into actuality of Plato's celebrated figure of the cave. The defect of the prisoners, let us recall, is that they cannot perceive the truth. The wall before them, on which the shadows play, is the screen on which press, motion picture, and radio project their account of life. The chains which keep the prisoners from turning their heads are the physical monopoly which the engines of publicity naturally possess. And is it not pathetically true that these victims, with their limited vision, are, quote, in the habit of conferring honors among themselves to those who are quickest to observe the passing shadows, and to remark which of them went before and which followed after, and which were together, end quote. The result is that insulation by technology has made the task of disseminating wisdom more difficult since Plato's day. In Athenian sophistry and demagoguery, Plato faced evils of the same kind, but they could not work behind such strategic entrenchment, and it was hardly as difficult for the wise man to make himself heard in centers of influence. Nothing is more natural than that, in the age dominated by materialism, authority should attach to those who possess. What chance today to make the situation concrete has a street corner preacher without means and without institutional sponsorship, and the competition with the glib assertions of a radio oracle? The denizens of the cave have never been so firmly enchained as in this age, which uses liberty as a veritable incantation. There are, it is true, certain hopeful signs of restiveness growing out of the condition. Most of us have observed among ordinary people a deep suspicion of propaganda since the First World War. The lesson of that disillusionment has lasted surprisingly. So intense has been this distrust that during the recent conflict, the most authentic stories of outrages, documented and proved in every possible way, either were met with outright disbelief, or were accepted gingerly and with reservations. The common man realizes that he has been misled, and that there are those who would mislead him again. But lacking analytical power, he tends to group every instance of organized expression with propaganda. In times of peace, too, he has exhibited a certain hard-headed resistance to attempts to drive or cajole him. We have seen in this country politicians elected in the face of almost unanimous press opposition. We note oftentimes a cagey dismissal of the obvious falsification in advertising, and I have heard simple men remark that newspapers should not print items of a private and distressing nature, such as we have classified as obscene. In serious writing, too, there are some hopeful portents of change. It has been noted how modern poets have reacted against the debased coinage of cliché language, and indications appear in other types of literature that the middle-class world picture is being abandoned. Perhaps Arthur Koestler is right, as the bourgeois novel flickers out. An entirely new type of writer is destined to appear. Quote, airmen, revolutionaries, adventurers, men who lead the dangerous life. End quote. Such indeed seems Ceylon, Saint-Exupéry, Hemingway. They will carry the gift for reflection into experiences of intense physical distress, and they will emerge with a more genuine concept for materialist explanations than has been seen for centuries. When Saint-Exupéry, for example, declares that, quote, the physical drama itself cannot touch us until someone points out its spiritual sense, end quote. He makes an affirmation of tragedy and significance. In a way, these men have the same recourse as medieval mystics who in suffering caught the vision. And since their faith has been tested by fire, they cannot be intimidated by those things which reduce the armchair philosopher to meekness. They have broken through the falsity and have returned to tell that the world is not at all what it has been made to seem. Not after one has cut loose from security and comfort and achieved a kind of freedom far from that promised by political liberals, who are themselves pushing slides into the Stereopticon. In reflecting on what is taught by extremities, one is reminded of Yeats's saying that saints and drunkards are never Whigs. It will certainly have to be asked whether European fascism was not just this impulse vulgarized and perverted. The rebellion of youth, the repudiation of bourgeois complacency, the attempt to renew the sense of, quote, holiness and heroism, end quote, appear the beginning of a revolt at least as deep-seated as that which made the French Revolution. The revolt was led by ignorant spirits who were impelled from behind by resentment, and who through their determination to invert the Christian ethic made an unexampled fiasco. There is no reason to believe, however, that the deep dissatisfaction with the superficiality of Western life has been removed or even mitigated, and this is why we wonder how long the Stereopticon can preserve the inane world which the bourgeois finds congenial. It is, after all, only a mechanical means of unifying empirical communities. In summary, the plea that the press, motion picture, and radio justify themselves by keeping people well informed turns out to be misleading. If one thinks merely of facts and of vivid sensations, the claim has some foundation. But he thinks of encouragement to meditation. The contrary rather is true, for by keeping the time element continuously present, and one may recall Henry James's description of journalism as criticism of the moment at the moment, they discourage composition and so promote the fragmentation already reviewed. We have seen in other connections how specialization is hostile to all kinds of organization, whether that organization is expressed as image, as whole, or as generalization. In the last analysis, this reveals itself as an attempt to prevent the simultaneous perception of successive events, which is the achievement of the philosopher. Materialism and success require the, quote, decomposed eternity, end quote, of time for their operation. And this is why we have these hidden but persistent attacks on memory, which holds successive events in a single picture. The successive perception of successive events is empiricism, the simultaneous perception, is idealism. Need we go further to account for the current dislike of long memories and for the hatred of the past? Recurring to Plato's observation that a philosopher must have good memory, let us inquire whether the continuous dissemination of news by the media under discussion does not produce the provincial in time. The constant stream of sensation, eulogized as lively propagation of what the public wants to hear, discourages the pulling together of events from past time into a whole for contemplation. Thus, absence of reflection keeps the individual from being aware of his former selves, and it is highly questionable whether anyone can be a member of a metaphysical community who does not preserve such memory. Upon the presence of the past in the present depends all conduct directed by knowledge. There can be little doubt that this condition of mind is a large factor in the low political morality of our age. Oswald Garrison Villard, a political journalist of the old school, who spent half a century crusading for standards of probity in public administration, once declared that he had never ceased to marvel at the shortness of the public's memory, at the rapidity with which it forgets episodes of scandal and incompetence. It sometimes appeared to him of little use to attack a party for its unethical conduct, for the voters would have no recollection of it. The glee with which the epithet, quote, ancient history, end quote, is applied to what is out of sight is, of course, a part of this barbarous attitude. The man of culture finds the whole past relevant. The bourgeois and the barbarian find relevant only what has some pressing connection with their appetites. Those who remember alone have a sense of relatedness, but whoever has a sense of relatedness is in at least the first grade of philosophy. Henry Ford's statement that history is bunk is a perfectly proper observation for a bourgeois industrialist, and it was followed with equal propriety by another, quote, creeds must go, end quote. Technology emancipates not only from memory, but also from faith. What humane spirit, after reading a newspaper or attending a popular motion picture, or listening to the farrago of nonsense on a radio program, has not found relief in fixing his gaze upon some characteristic bit of nature? It is escape from the sickly metaphysical dream. Under the surfeit of falsity, born of technology and commercialism, we rejoice in returning to primary data and to assurance that the world is a world of enduring forms, which in themselves are neither brutal nor sentimental.